Lost illusions. Two poets. At the time when this story opens, the Stanhope press and the ink distributing roller were not as yet in general use in small provincial printing establishments. Even at Angoulême, so closely connected through its paper mills with the art of typography in Paris, the only machinery in use was the primitive wooden invention to which the language owes a figure of speech. The press groans was no mere rhetorical expression in those days. Leather ink balls were still used in old-fashioned printing houses. The pressman dabbed the ink by hand on the characters, and the movable table on which the form of type was placed in readiness for the sheet of paper, being made of marble, literally deserved its name of impression stone. Modern machinery has swept all this old-world mechanism into oblivion. The wooden press which, with all its imperfections, turned out such beautiful work for the Elzevers, Plantin, Aldus, and Didot is so completely forgotten, that something must be said as to the obsolete gear on which Jerome Nicolas Seched set an almost superstitious affection, for it plays a part in this chronicle of great small things. Seched had been in his time a journeyman pressman, a bear in compositors' slang. The continued pacing to and fro of the pressman from ink table to press, from press to ink table, no doubt suggested the nickname. The bears, however, make matters even by calling the compositors monkeys, on account of the nimble industry displayed by those gentlemen in picking out the type from the 152 compartments of the cases. In the disastrous year 1793, Seched, being 50 years old and a married man, escaped the Great Requisition which swept the bulk of French workmen into the army. The old pressman was the only hand left in the printing house, and when the master, otherwise the gaffer, died, leaving a widow, but no children, the business seemed to be on the verge of extinction, for the solitary bear was quite incapable of the feat of transformation into a monkey, and in his quality of pressman had never learned to read or write. Just then, however, a representative of the people being in a mighty hurry to publish the decrees of the convention, bestowed a master printer's license on Seched, and requisitioned the establishment. Citizen Seched accepted the dangerous patent, bought the business of his master's widow with his wife's savings, and took over the plant at half its value. But he was not even at the beginning. He was bound to print the decrees of the Republic without mistakes and without delay. In this strait Jerome Nicolas Seched had the luck to discover a noble Marseillaise who had no mind to emigrate and lose his lands, nor yet to show himself openly and lose his head, and consequently was fain to earn a living by some lawful industry. Le Comte de Morecombe, disguised in a provincial printer's jacket, set up, read, and corrected the decrees which forbade citizens to harbour aristocrats under pain of death, while the bear, now a gaffer, printed the copies and duly posted them, and the pair remained safe and sound. In 1795, when the squall of the Terror had passed over, Nicolas Seched was obliged to look out for another jack of all trades to be compositor, reader, and foreman in one. The abbé became a bishop at the Restoration, and in after days the count and the abbé met and sat together on the same bench of the House of Peers. In 1795 Jerome Nicolas had not known how to read or write. In 1802 he had made no progress in either art, but by allowing a handsome margin for wear and tear in his estimates, he managed to pay a foreman's wages. The once easy-going journeyman was a terror to his bears and monkeys. Where poverty ceases, avarice begins. From the day when Seched first caught a glimpse of the possibility of making a fortune, a growing covetousness developed and sharpened in him a certain practical faculty for business, greedy, suspicious, and keen-eyed. He carried on his craft in disdain of theory. In course of time he had learned to estimate at a glance the cost of printing per page or per sheet in every kind of type. He proved to unlettered customers that large type costs more to move, or, if small type was under discussion, that it was more difficult to handle. The setting up of the type was the one part of his craft of which he knew nothing, and so great was his terror lest he should not charge enough, that he always made a heavy profit. He never took his eyes off his compositors while they were paid by the hour. If he knew that a paper manufacturer was in difficulties, he would buy up his stock at a cheap rate and warehouse the paper. So from this time forward he was his own landlord, and owned the old house which had been a printing office from time immemorial. He had every sort of luck. He was left a widower with but one son. The boy he sent to the grammar school. He must be educated, not so much for his own sake as to train a successor to the business, and Seched treated the lad harshly so as to prolong the time of parental rule, making him work at place on holidays, telling him that he must learn to earn his own living, so as to recompense his poor old father, who was slaving his life out to give him an education. Then the abbey went, and Seched promoted one of his 4 compositors to be foreman, making his choice on the future bishop's recommendation of the man as an honest and intelligent workman. In these ways the worthy printer thought to tide over the time until his son could take a business which was sure to extend in young and clever hands. David Seced's school career was a brilliant one. Old Seched, as a bear who had succeeded in life without any education, entertained a very considerable contempt for attainments in book learning, and when he sent his son to Paris to study the higher branches of typography, he recommended the lad so earnestly to save a good round sum in the working man's paradise, as he was pleased to call the city, and so distinctly gave the boy to understand that he was not to draw upon the paternal purse, that it seemed as if old Seched saw some way of gaining private ends of his own by that sojourn in the land of sapience. So David learned his trade, and completed his education at the same time, and Didot's foreman became a scholar, and yet when he left Paris at the end of 1819, summoned home by his father to take the helm of business, he had not cost his parent a farthing. Now Nicholas Seced's establishment hitherto had enjoyed a monopoly of all the official printing in the department, besides the work of the prefecture and the diocese, 3 connections which should prove mighty profitable to an active young printer, but precisely at this juncture the firm of Cointe Brothers, paper manufacturers, applied to the authorities for the second printer's license in Angoulême. Hitherto old Seched had contrived to reduce this license to a dead letter, thanks to the war crisis of the empire, and consequent atrophy of commercial enterprise, but he had neglected to buy up the right himself, and this piece of parsimony was the ruin of the old business. Seched thought joyfully when he heard the news that the coming struggle with the Quantes would be fought out by his son and not by himself. I should have gone to the wall, he thought, but a young fellow from the Didos will pull through. The septuagenarian sighed for the time when he could live at ease in his own fashion. If his knowledge of the higher branches of the craft of printing was scanty, on the other hand, he was supposed to be past master of an art which workmen pleasantly call typography, an art held in high esteem by the divine author of Pantagruel, though of late, by reason of the persecution of society's YCLEPT of temperance, the cult has fallen, day by day, into disuse. Jerome Nicholas Seched, bound by the laws of etymology to be a dry subject, suffered from an inextinguishable thirst. His wife, during her lifetime, managed to control within reasonable bounds the passion for the juice of the grape, a taste so natural to the bear that M. de Chateaubriand remarked it among the ursine tribes of the New World. But philosophers inform us that old age is apt to revert to the habits of youth, and Seched Senior is a case in point. The older he grew, the better he loved to drink. The master passion had given a stamp of originality to an ursine physiognomy, his nose had developed till it reached the proportions of a double great cannoneer, his veined cheeks looked like vine leaves, covered, as they were, with bloated patches of purple, madder red, and often mottled hues, till altogether, the countenance suggested a huge truffle clasped about by autumn vine tendrils. The little grey eyes, peering out from beneath thick eyebrows like bushes covered with snow, were agleam with the cunning of avarice that had extinguished everything else in the man, down to the very instinct of fatherhood. Those eyes never lost their cunning even when disguised in drink. Seched put you in mind of one of La Fontaine's Franciscan friars, with the fringe of grizzled hair still curling about his bald pate. He was short and corpulent, like one of the old-fashioned lamps for illumination, that burn a vast deal of oil to a very small piece of wick, for excess of any sort confirms the habit of body, and drunkenness, like much study, makes the fat man stouter, and the lean man leaner still. For 30 years Jerome Nicholas Seched had worn the famous municipal three-cornered hat, which you may still see here and there on the head of the town crier in out-of-the-way places. His breeches and waistcoat were of greenish velveteen, and he wore an old-fashioned brown greatcoat, grey cotton stockings, and shoes with silver buckles to them. This costume, in which the workman shone through the burgess, was so thoroughly in keeping with the man's character, defects, and way of life, that he might have come ready dressed into the world. You could no more imagine him apart from his clothes than you could think of a bulb without its husk. If the old printer had not long since given the measure of his blind greed, the very nature of the man came out in the manner of his abdication. Knowing, as he did, that his son must have learned his business pretty thoroughly in the great school of the Didos, he had yet been ruminating for a long while over the bargain that he meant to drive with David. All that the father made, the son, of course, was bound to lose, but in business this worthy knew nothing of father or son. If, in the first instance, he had looked on David as his only child, later he came to regard him as the natural purchaser of the business, whose interests were therefore his own. Setchard meant to sell dear, David, of course, to buy cheap. His son, therefore, was an antagonist, and it was his duty to get the better of him. The transformation of sentiment into self-seeking, ordinarily slow, tortuous, and veiled by hypocrisy in better educated people, was swift and direct in the old bear, who demonstrated the superiority of shrewd typography over book-learned typography. David came home, and the old man received him with all the cordiality which cunning folk can assume with an eye to business. He was as full of thought for him as any lover for his mistress, giving him his arm, telling him where to put his foot down so as to avoid the mud, warming the bed for him, lighting a fire in his room, making his supper ready. The next day, after he had done his best to fluster his son's wits over a sumptuous dinner, Jerome Nicholas Setchard, after copious potations, began with a "now for business," a remark so singularly misplaced between two hiccups, that David begged his parent to postpone serious matters until the morrow. But the old bear was by no means inclined to put off the long-expected battle. He was too well prepared to turn his tipsiness to good account. He had dragged the chain these 50 years, he would not wear it another hour, tomorrow his son should be the gaffer. Perhaps a word or two about the business premises may be said here. The printing house had been established since the reign of Louis XIV in the angle made by the Rue de Beaulieu and the Place du Murier. It had been devoted to its present purposes for a long time past. The ground floor consisted of a single huge room lighted on the side next the street by an old-fashioned casement, and by a large sash window that gave upon the yard at the back. A passage at the side led to the private office, but in the provinces the processes of typography excite such a lively interest, that customers usually preferred to enter by way of the glass door in the street front, though they at once descended 3 steps, for the floor of the workshop lay below the level of the street. The gaping newcomer always failed to note the perils of the passage through the shop, and while staring at the sheets of paper strung in groves across the ceiling, ran against the rows of cases, or knocked his hat against the tie bars that secured the presses in position. Or the customer's eyes would follow the agile movements of a compositor, picking out type from the 152 compartments of his case, reading his copy, verifying the words in the composing stick, and leading the lines, till a ream of damp paper weighted with heavy slabs, and set down in the middle of the gangway, tripped up the bemused spectator, or he caught his hip against the angle of a bench, to the huge delight of boys, bears, and monkeys. No white had ever been known to reach the further end without accident. A couple of glass-windowed cages had been built out into the yard at the back, the foreman sat in state in the one, the master printer in the other. Out in the yard the walls were agreeably decorated by trellised vines, a tempting bit of color, considering the owner's reputation. On the one side of the space stood the kitchen, on the other the woodshed, and in a ramshackle penthouse against the hall at the back, the paper was trimmed and damped down. Here, too, the forms, or, in ordinary language, the masses of setup type, were washed. Inky streams issuing thence blended with the ooze from the kitchen sink, and found their way into the kennel in the street outside, till peasants coming into the town of a market day believed that the devil was taking a wash inside the establishment. As to the house above the printing office, it consisted of 3 rooms on the first floor and a couple of attics in the roof. The first room did duty as dining room and lobby. It was exactly the same length as the passage below, less the space taken up by the old-fashioned wooden staircase, and was lighted by a narrow casement on the street and a bull's-eye window looking into the yard. The chief characteristic of the apartment was a cynic simplicity, due to money-making greed. The bare walls were covered with plain whitewash, the dirty brick floor had never been scoured, the furniture consisted of 3 rickety chairs, a round table, and a sideboard stationed between the 2 doors of a bedroom and a sitting room. Windows and doors alike were dingy with accumulated grime. Reams of blank paper or printed matter usually encumbered the floor, and more frequently than not the remains of Sechet's dinner, empty bottles and plates, were lying about on the packages. The bedroom was lighted on the side of the yard by a window with leaded panes, and hung with the old-world tapestry that decorated housefronts in provincial towns on Corpus Christi Day. For furniture it boasted a vast 4-post bedstead with canopy, valances and quilt of crimson serge, a couple of worm-eaten armchairs, 2 tapestry-covered chairs in walnut wood, an aged bureau, and a timepiece on the mantel shelf. The Seigneur Rousseau, Jerome Nicholas' master and predecessor, had furnished the homely old-world room. It was just as he had left it. The sitting room had been partly modernized by the late MME. Sechet. The walls were adorned with a wainscot, fearful to behold, painted the color of powder blue. The panels were decorated with wallpaper oriental scenes in sepia tint, and for all furniture, half a dozen chairs with lyre-shaped backs and blue leather cushions were ranged round the room. The 2 clumsy arched windows that gave upon the Place du Murier were curtainless. There was neither clock nor candle sconce nor mirror above the mantel shelf, for MME. Sechet had died before she carried out her scheme of decoration, and the bear, unable to conceive the use of improvements that brought in no return in money, had left it at this point. Hither, P. titubante, Jerome Nicholas Sechet brought his son, and pointed to a sheet of paper lying on the table, a valuation of plant drawn up by the foreman under his direction. "Read that, my boy," said Jerome Nicholas, rolling a drunken eye from the paper to his son, and back to the paper. "You will see what a jewel of a printing house I am giving you." Three wooden presses, held in position by iron tie bars, cast iron plates. An improvement of my own, put in Seched Senior. Together with all the implements, ink tables, balls, benches, etc., 1,600 francs. "Why, father," cried David, letting the sheet fall, "these presses of yours are old sabots not worth 100 crowns, they are only fit for firewood." "Sabots," cried old Seched, "sabots." "There, take the inventory and let us go downstairs." "You will soon see whether your paltry iron work contrivances will work like these solid old tools, tried and trusty." "You will not have the heart after that to slander honest old presses that go like mail coaches, and are good to last you your lifetime without needing repairs of any sort." "Sabots." "Yes, sabots that are like to hold salt enough to cook your eggs with, sabots that your father has plodded on with these 20 years, they have helped him to make you what you are." The father, without coming to grief on the way, lurched down the worn, knotty staircase that shook under his tread. In the passage he opened the door of the workshop, flew to the nearest press, artfully oiled and cleaned for the occasion, and pointed out the strong oaken cheeks, polished up by the apprentice. "Isn't it a love of a press?" A wedding announcement lay in the press. The old bear folded down the frisket upon the tympan, and the tympan upon the form, ran in the carriage, worked the lever, drew out the carriage, and lifted the frisket and tympan, all with as much agility as the youngest of the tribe. The press, handled in this sort, creaked aloud in such fine style that you might have thought some bird had dashed itself against the window pane and flown away again. "Where is the English press that could go at that pace?" the parent asked of his astonished son. Old Seched hurried to the second, and then to the third in order, repeating the maneuver with equal dexterity. The third presenting to his wine-troubled eye a patch overlooked by the apprentice, with a notable oath he rubbed it with the skirt of his overcoat, much as a horse dealer polishes the coat of an animal that he is trying to sell. With those 3 presses, David, you can make your 9,000 francs a year without a foreman. As your future partner, I am opposed to your replacing these presses by your cursed cast-iron machinery, that wears out the type. You in Paris have been making such a to-do over that damned Englishman's invention, a foreigner, an enemy of France who wants to help the iron founders to a fortune. Oh, you wanted Stanhopes, did you? Thanks for your Stanhopes, that cost 2,500 francs apiece, about twice as much as my 3 jewels put together, and more your type to pieces, because there is no give in 'em. I haven't book learning like you, but you keep this well in mind, the life of the Stanhope is the death of the type. Those 3 presses will serve your turn well enough, the printing will be properly done, and folk here in Angoulême won't ask any more of you. You may print with presses made of wood or iron or gold or silver, they will never pay you a farthing more. Item, pursued David, £5,000 weight of type from M. Vaffler's foundry. Dido's apprentice could not help smiling at the name. Laugh away. After 12 years of wear, that type is as good as new. That is what I call a type founder. M. Vafflard is an honest man, who uses hard metal, and, to my way of thinking, the best type founder is the one you go to most seldom. Taken at 10,000 francs, continued David. £10,000, father. Why, that is 2 francs a pound, and the Messrs. Dido only ask 36 sous for the Cicero. These nail heads of yours will only fetch the price of old metal 5d a pound. You call M. Giles italics, running hand and round hand, nail heads, do you? M. Gile, that used to be printer to the Emperor. And type that costs 6 francs a pound, masterpieces of engraving, bought only 5 years ago. Some of them are as bright yet as when they came from the foundry. Look here. Old Setchard pounced upon some packets of unused sorts, and held them out for David to see. I am not book-learned, I don't know how to read or write, but, all the same, I know enough to see that M. Giles' sloping letters are the fathers of your messes. Dido's English running hand. Here is the round hand, he went on, taking up an unused piker type. David saw that there was no way of coming to terms with his father. It was a case of yes or no, of taking or leaving it. The very ropes across the ceiling had gone down into the old bear's inventory, and not the smallest item was omitted. Jobbing chasers, wetting boards, paste pots, rinsing trough, and lye brushes had all been put down and valued separately with miserly exactitude. The total amounted to 30,000 francs, including the license and the goodwill. David asked himself whether or not this thing was feasible. Old Setchard grew uneasy over his son's silence. He would rather have had stormy argument than a wordless acceptance of the situation. Chaffering in these sorts of bargains means that a man can look after his interests. A man who is ready to pay you anything you ask will pay nothing, Old Setchard was saying to himself. While he tried to follow his son's train of thought, he went through the list of odds and ends of plant needed by a country business, drawing David now to a hot press, now to a cutting press, bragging of its usefulness and sound condition. "Old tools are always the best tools," said he. In our line of business they ought to fetch more than the new, like Goldbeater's tools. Hideous vignettes, representing Hymen and Cupids, skeletons raising the lids of their tombs to describe a V or an M, and huge borders of masks for theatrical posters became in turn objects of tremendous value through old Jerome Nicholas Vinous eloquence. Old custom, he told his son, was so deeply rooted in the district that he David would only waste his pains if he gave them the finest things in life. He himself had tried to sell them a better class of almanac than the double ligeois on grocer's paper, and what came of it? The original double ligeois sold better than the most sumptuous calendars. David would soon see the importance of these old-fashioned things when he found he could get more for them than for the most costly new-fangled articles. Aha! My boy, Paris is Paris, and the provinces are the provinces. If a man came in from Lumo with an order for wedding cards, and you were to print them without a cupid and garlands, he would not believe that he was properly married. You would have them all back again if you sent them out with a plain M after the style of your Messrs. Dido. They may be fine printers, but their inventions won't take in the provinces for another 100 years. So there you are. A generous man is a bad bargain driver. David's nature was of the sensitive and affectionate type that shrinks from a dispute, and gives way at once if an opponent touches his feelings. His loftiness of feeling, and the fact that the old toper had himself well in hand, put him still further at a disadvantage in a dispute about money matters with his own father, especially as he credited that father with the best intentions, and took his covetous greed for a printer's attachment to his old familiar tools. Still, as Jerome Nicolas Seched had taken the whole place over from Rousseau's widow for 10,000 francs, paid in assignats, it stood to reason that 30,000 francs in coin at the present day was an exorbitant demand. "Father, you are cutting my throat," exclaimed David. "I," cried the old toper, raising his hand to the lines of cord across the ceiling, "I who gave you life." "Why, David, what do you suppose the license is worth?" "Do you know that the sheet of advertisements alone, at 5 pence a line, brought in 500 francs last month?" "You turn up the books, lad, and see what we make by placards and the registers at the prefecture, and the work for the mayor's office, and the bishop too." "You are a do-nothing that has no mind to get on." "You are haggling over the horse that will carry you to some pretty bit of property like Marsac." Attached to the valuation of plant there was a deed of partnership between Seched Sr. and his son. The good father was to let his house and premises to the new firm for 1,200 francs per annum, reserving one of the 2 rooms in the roof for himself. So long as David's purchase money was not paid in full, the profits were to be divided equally. As soon as he paid off his father, he was to be made sole proprietor of the business. David made a mental calculation of the value of the license, the goodwill, and the stock of paper, leaving the plant out of account. It was just possible, he thought, to clear off the debt. He accepted the conditions. Old Setchard, accustomed to peasants haggling, knowing nothing of the wider business views of Paris, was amazed at such a prompt conclusion. Can he have been putting money by? He asked himself. Or is he scheming out, at this moment, some way of not paying me? With this notion in his head, he tried to find out whether David had any money with him. He wanted to be paid something on account. The old man's inquisitiveness roused his son's distrust. David remained close buttoned up to the chin. Next day, old Setchard made the apprentice move all his own household stuff up into the attic until such time as an empty market cart could take it out on the return journey into the country, and David entered into possession of 3 bare, unfurnished rooms on the day that saw him installed in the printing house, without 1 sou wherewith to pay his men's wages. When he asked his father, as a partner, to contribute his share towards the working expenses, the old man pretended not to understand. He had found the printing house, he said, and he was not bound to find the money too. He had paid his share. Pressed close by his son's reasoning, he answered that when he himself had paid Rousseau's widow he had not had a penny left. If he, a poor, ignorant working man, had made his way, Didot's apprentice should do still better. Besides, had not David been earning money, thanks to an education paid for by the sweat of his old father's brow? Now surely was the time when the education would come in useful. "What have you done with your Poles?" he asked, returning to the charge. He meant to have light on a problem which his son left unresolved the day before. "Why, had I not to live?" David asked indignantly, "and books to buy besides?" "Oh, you bought books, did you? You will make a poor man of business." "A man that buys books is hardly fit to print them," retorted the bear. Then David endured the most painful of humiliations, the sense of shame for a parent. There was nothing for it but to be passive while his father poured out a flood of reasons, sordid, whining, contemptible, money-getting reasons in which the niggardly old man wrapped his refusal. David crushed down his pain into the depths of his soul. He saw that he was alone, saw that he had no one to look to but himself, saw, too, that his father was trying to make money out of him, and in a spirit of philosophical curiosity, he tried to find out how far the old man would go. He called old Sechet's attention to the fact that he had never as yet made any inquiry as to his mother's fortune. If that fortune would not buy the printing house, it might go some ways towards paying the working expenses. "Your mother's fortune," echoed old Sechet. "Why, it was her beauty and intelligence." David understood his father thoroughly after that answer. He understood that only after an interminable, expensive, and disgraceful lawsuit could he obtain any account of the money which by rights was his. The noble heart accepted the heavy burden laid upon it, seeing clearly beforehand how difficult it would be to free himself from the engagements into which he had entered with his father. "I will work," he said to himself. "After all, if I have a rough time of it, so had the old man. Besides, I shall be working for myself, shall I not?" "I am leaving you a treasure," said Sechet, uneasy at his son's silence. David asked what the treasure might be. "Marian," said his father. Marian, a big country girl, was an indispensable part of the establishment. It was Marian who damped the paper and cut it to size, Marian did the cooking, washing, and marketing, Marian unloaded the paper carts, collected accounts, and cleaned the inkballs, and if Marian had but known how to read, old Sechet would have put her to set up type into the bargain. Old Sechet set out on foot for the country. Delighted as he was with his sale of the business, he was not quite easy in his mind as to the payment. To the throes of the vendor, the agony of uncertainty as to the completion of the purchase inevitably succeeds. Passion of every sort is essentially Jesuitical. Here was a man who thought that education was useless, forcing himself to believe in the influence of education. He was mortgaging 30,000 francs upon the ideas of honor and conduct which education should have developed in his son. David had received a good training, so David would sweat blood and water to fulfill his engagements. David's knowledge would discover new resources, and David seemed to be full of fine feelings, so David would pay. Many a parent does in this way, and thinks that he has acted a father's part. Old Secchard was quite of that opinion by the time that he had reached his vineyard at Marsac, a hamlet some 4 leagues out of Angoulême. The previous owner had built a nice little house on the bit of property, and from year to year had added other bits of land to it, until in 1809 the old bear bought the whole, and went thither, exchanging the toil of the printing press for the labor of the winepress. As he put it himself, he had been in that line so long that he ought to know something about it. During the first 12 months of rural retirement, Secchard Sr. showed a careful countenance among his vine props, for he was always in his vineyard now, just as, in the old days, he had lived in his shop, day in, day out. The prospect of 30,000 francs was even more intoxicating than sweet wine. Already in imagination he fingered the coin. The less the claim to the money, the more eager he grew to pouch it. Not seldom his anxieties sent him hurrying from Marsac to Angoulême. He would climb up the rocky staircases into the old city and walk into his son's workshop to see how business went. There stood the presses in their places. The one apprentice, in a paper cap, was cleaning the ink balls. There was a creaking of a press over the printing of some trade circular. The old type was still unchanged, and in the dens at the end of the room he saw his son and the foreman reading books, which the bear took for proof sheets. Then he would join David at dinner and go back to Marsac, chewing the cud of uneasy reflection. Avarice, like love, has the gift of second sight, instinctively guessing at future contingencies, and hugging its presentiments. Seched Sr. living at a distance, far from the workshop and the machinery which possessed such a fascination for him, reminding him, as it did, of days when he was making his way, could feel that there were disquieting symptoms of inactivity in his son. The name of Quante brothers haunted him like a dread. He saw Seched and son dropping into the second place. In short, the old man scented misfortune in the wind. His presentiments were too well founded. Disaster was hovering over the house of Seched. But there is a tutelary deity for misers, and by a chain of unforeseen circumstances that tutelary deity was so ordering matters that the purchase money of his extortionate bargain was to be tumbled after all into the old toper's pouch. Indifferent to the religious reaction brought about by the Restoration, indifferent no less to the liberal movement, David preserved a most unlucky neutrality on the burning questions of the day. In those times provincial men of business were bound to profess political opinions of some sort if they meant to secure custom. They were forced to choose for themselves between the patronage of the liberals on the one hand or the royalists on the other. And love, moreover, had come to David's heart, and with his scientific preoccupation and finer nature he had not room for the dogged greed of which our successful man of business is made. It choked the keen money-getting instinct which would have led him to study the differences between the Paris trade and the business of a provincial printing house. The shades of opinion so sharply defined in the country are blurred and lost in the great currents of Parisian business life. Quante brothers set themselves deliberately to assimilate all shades of monarchical opinion. They let everyone know that they fasted of a Friday and kept Lent, they haunted the cathedral, they cultivated the society of the clergy, and in consequence, when books of devotion were once more in demand, Quante brothers were the first in this lucrative field. They slandered David, accusing him of liberalism, atheism, and what not. How, asked they, could anyone employ a man whose father had been a Septembrist, a Bonapartist, and a drunkard to boot? The old man was sure to leave plenty of gold pieces behind him. They themselves were poor men with families to support, while David was a bachelor and could do as he pleased. He would have plenty one of these days, he could afford to take things easily, whereas, and so forth and so forth. Such tales against David, once put into circulation, produced their effect. The monopoly of the prefectorial and diocesan work passed gradually into the hands of Cointe brothers, and before long David's keen competitors, emboldened by his inaction, started a second local sheet of advertisements and announcements. The older establishment was left at length with the job printing orders from the town, and the circulation of the Charente Chronicle fell off by one half. Meanwhile the Cointes grew richer, they had made handsome profits on their devotional books, and now they offered to buy Sechet's paper, to have all the trade and judicial announcements of the department in their own hands. The news of this proposal sent by David to his father brought the old vinegrower from Marsac into the Place du Murier with the swiftness of the raven that scents the corpses on a battlefield. "Leave me to manage the Cointes," said he to his son, "don't you meddle in this business." The old man saw what the Cointes meant, and they took alarm at his clear-sighted sagacity. His son was making a blunder, he said, and he, Sechet, had come to put a stop to it. What was to become of the connection if David gave up the paper? All the attorneys and solicitors and men of business in Lumo were liberals to a man. The Cointes had tried to ruin the Sechets by accusing them of liberalism, and by so doing gave them a plank to cling to. The Sechets should keep the liberal business. Sell the paper indeed. Why, you might as well sell the stock in trade and the license. Old Sechet asked the Cointes 60,000 francs for the printing business, so as not to ruin his son. He was fond of his son, he was taking his son's part. The vinegrower brought his son to the front to gain his point, as a peasant brings in his wife. His son was unwilling to do this, that, or the other, it varied according to the offers which he wrung one after another from the Cointes, until, not without an effort, he drew them on to give 22,000 francs for the Charente Chronicle. But, at the same time, David must pledge himself thenceforward to print no newspaper whatsoever, under a penalty of 30,000 francs for damages. That transaction dealt the deathblow to the Sechet establishment, but the old vinegrower did not trouble himself much on that head. Murder usually follows robbery. Our worthy friend intended to pay himself with the ready money. To have the cash in his own hands he would have given in David himself over and above the bargain, and so much the more willingly since that this nuisance of a son could claim one half of the unexpected windfall. Taking this fact into consideration, therefore, the generous parent consented to abandon his share of the business but not the business premises, and the rental was still maintained at the famous sum of 1,200 francs per annum. The old man came into town very seldom after the paper was sold to the Cointes. He pleaded his advanced age, but the truth was that he took little interest in the establishment now that it was his no longer. Still, he could not quite shake off his old kindness for his stock in trade, and when business brought him into Angoulême, it would have been hard to say which was the stronger attraction to the old house, his wooden presses or the son whom, as a matter of form, he asked for rent. The old foreman, who had gone over to the rival establishment, knew exactly how much this fatherly generosity was worth. The old fox meant to reserve a right to interfere in his son's affairs, and had taken care to appear in the bankruptcy as a privileged creditor for arrears of rent. The causes of David's heedlessness throw a light on the character of that young man. Only a few days after his establishment in the paternal printing office, he came across an old school friend in the direst poverty. Lucien Chardin, a young fellow of 21 or thereabouts, was the son of a surgeon major who had retired with a wound from the Republican Army. Nature had meant M. Chardin Sr. for a chemist. Chance opened the way for a retail druggist's business in Angoulême. After many years of scientific research, death cut him off in the midst of his incompleted experiments, and the great discovery that should have brought wealth to the family was never made. Chardin had tried to find a specific for the gout. Gout is a rich man's malady. The rich will pay large sums to recover health when they have lost it, and for this reason the druggist deliberately selected gout as his problem. Halfway between the man of science on the one side and the charlatan on the other, he saw that the scientific method was the one road to assured success, and had studied the causes of the complaint, and based his remedy on a certain general theory of treatment, with modifications in practice for varying temperaments. Then, on a visit to Paris undertaken to solicit the approval of the Académie des Sciences, he died, and lost all the fruits of his labors. It may have been that some presentiment of the end had led the country druggist to do all that in him lay to give his boy and girl a good education. The family had been living up to the income brought in by the business, and now when they were left almost destitute, it was an aggravation of their misfortune that they had been brought up in the expectations of a brilliant future, for these hopes were extinguished by their father's death. The great Desplein, who attended Chardin in his last illness, saw him die in convulsions of rage. The secret of the army surgeon's ambition lay in his passionate love for his wife, the last survivor of the family of Rubempré, saved as by a miracle from the guillotine in 1793. He had gained time by declaring that she was pregnant, a lie told without the girl's knowledge or consent. Then, when in a manner he had created a claim to call her his wife, he had married her in spite of their common poverty. The children of this marriage, like all children of love, inherited the mother's wonderful beauty, that gift so often fatal when accompanied by poverty. The life of hope and hard work and despair, in all of which Mme. Chardin had shared with such keen sympathy, had left deep traces in her beautiful face, just as the slow decline of a scanty income had changed her ways and habits, but both she and her children confronted evil days bravely enough. She sold the druggist's shop in the Grande Rue de l'Humeau, the principal suburb of Angoulême, but it was impossible for even one woman to exist on the 300 francs of income brought in by the investment of the purchase money, so the mother and daughter accepted the position, and worked to earn a living. The mother went out as a monthly nurse, and for her gentle manners was preferred to any other among the wealthy houses, where she lived without expense to her children, and earned some 7 francs a week. To save her son the embarrassment of seeing his mother reduced to this humble position, she assumed the name of Madame Charlotte, and persons requiring her services were requested to apply to M. Postel, M. Chardin's successor in the business. Lucien's sister worked for a laundress, a decent woman much respected in Lumeau, and earned 15 daily sous. As MME. Priya's forewoman she had a certain position in the workroom, which raised her slightly above the class of working girls. The two women's slender earnings, together with MME. Chardin's 300 francs of rentes, amounted to about 800 francs a year, and on this sum 3 persons must be fed, clothed, and lodged. Yet, with all their frugal thrift, the pittance was scarcely sufficient, nearly the whole of it was needed for Lucien. MME, Chardin and her daughter Eve believed in Lucien as Mahomet's wife believed in her husband, their devotion for his future knew no bounds. Their present landlord was the successor to the business, for M. Postel let them have rooms at the further end of a yard at the back of the laboratory for a very low rent, and Lucien slept in the poor garret above. A father's passion for natural science had stimulated the boy, and at first induced him to follow in the same path. Lucien was one of the most brilliant pupils at the grammar school of Angoulême, and when David Sechet left, his future friend was in the 3rd form. When chance brought the school fellows together again, Lucien was weary of drinking from the rude cup of penury, and ready for any of the rash, decisive steps that youth takes at the age of 20. David's generous offer of 40 francs a month if Lucien would come to him and learn the work of a printer's reader came in time. David had no need whatever of a printer's reader, but he saved Lucien from despair. The ties of a school friendship thus renewed were soon drawn closer than ever by the similarity of their lot in life and the dissimilarity of their characters. Both felt high-swelling hopes of manifold success, both consciously possessed the high order of intelligence which sets a man on a level with lofty heights, consigned though they were socially to the lowest level. Fate's injustice was a strong bond between them. And then, by different ways, following each his own bent of mind, they had attained to poesy. Lucien, destined for the highest speculative fields of natural science, was aiming with hot enthusiasm at fame through literature, while David, with that meditative temperament which inclines to poetry, was drawn by his tastes towards natural science. The exchange of roles was the beginning of an intellectual comradeship. Before long, Lucien told David of his own father's far-sighted views of the application of science to manufacture, while David pointed out the new ways in literature that Lucien must follow if he meant to succeed. Not many days had passed before the young men's friendship became a passion such as is only known in early manhood. Then it was that David caught a glimpse of Eve's fair face, and loved, as grave and meditative natures can love. The "E nunc semper e in secula seculorum" of the liturgy is the device taken by many a sublime unknown poet, whose works consist in magnificent epics conceived and lost between heart and heart. With a lover's insight, David read the secret hopes set by the mother and sister on Lucien's poet's brow, and knowing the blind devotion, it was very sweet to him to draw nearer to his love by sharing her hopes and her self-sacrifice. And in this way Lucien came to be David's chosen brother. As there are ultras who would fain be more royalist than the king, so David outdid the mother and sister in his belief in Lucien's genius. He spoiled Lucien as a mother spoils her child. Once, under pressure of the lack of money which tied their hands, the two were ruminating after the manner of young men over ways of promptly realizing a large fortune, and, after fruitless shakings of all the trees already stripped by previous comers, Lucien bethought himself of two of his father's ideas. Chardin had talked of a method of refining sugar by a chemical process, which would reduce the cost of production by 1/2, and he had another plan for employing an American vegetable fiber for making paper, something after the Chinese fashion, and effecting an enormous saving in the cost of raw material. David, knowing the importance of a question raised already by the Didos, caught at this latter notion, saw a fortune in it, and looked upon Lucien as the benefactor whom he could never repay. Anyone may guess how the ruling thoughts and inner life of this pair of friends unfitted them for carrying on the business of a printing house. So far from making 15 to 20,000 francs, like Cointet brothers, printers and publishers to the diocese, and proprietors of the Charente Chronicle, now the only newspaper in the department, Seched and Son made a bare 300 francs per month, out of which the foreman's salary must be paid, as well as Marion's wages and the rent and taxes, so that David himself was scarcely making 1,200 francs per annum. Active and industrious men of business would have bought new type and new machinery, and made an effort to secure orders for cheap printing from the Paris book trade, but master and foreman, deep in absorbing intellectual interests, were quite content with such orders as came to them from their remaining customers. In the long length the Cointets had come to understand David's character and habits. They did not slander him now, on the contrary, wise policy required that they should allow the business to flicker on. It was to their interest indeed to maintain it in a small way, lest it should fall into the hands of some more formidable competitor. They made a practice of sending prospectuses and circulars, job printing, as it is called, to the Sechet's establishment. So it came about that, all unwittingly, David owed his existence, commercially speaking, to the cunning schemes of his competitors. The Cointets, well pleased with his craze, as they called it, behaved to all appearance both fairly and handsomely, but, as a matter of fact, they were adopting the tactics of the male coach owners who set up a sham opposition coach to keep bona fide rivals out of the field. Inside and outside, the condition of the Seched printing establishment bore testimony to the sordid avarice of the old bear, who never spent a penny on repairs. The old house had stood in sun and rain, and borne the brunt of the weather, till it looked like some venerable tree trunk set down at the entrance of the alley, so riven it was with seams and cracks of all sorts and sizes. The house front, built of brick and stone, with no pretensions to symmetry, seemed to be bending beneath the weight of a worm-eaten roof covered with the curved pantiles in common use in the south of France. The decrepit casements were fitted with the heavy, unwieldy shutters necessary in that climate, and held in place by massive iron crossbars. It would have puzzled you to find a more dilapidated house in Angoulême. Nothing but sheer tenacity of mortar kept it together. Try to picture the workshop, lighted at either end, and dark in the middle, the walls covered with handbills and begrimed by friction of all the workmen who had rubbed past them for 30 years, the cobweb of cordage across the ceiling, the stacks of paper, the old-fashioned presses, the pile of slabs for weighting the damp sheets, the rows of cases, and the 2 dens in the far corners where the master printer and foreman sat, and you will have some idea of the life led by the 2 friends. One day early in May, 1821, David and Lucien were standing together by the window that looked into the yard. It was nearly 2 o'clock, and the 4 or 5 men were going out to dinner. David waited until the apprentice had shut the street door with the bell fastened to it, then he drew Lucien out into the yard as if the smell of paper, ink, and presses and old woodwork had grown intolerable to him, and together they sat down under the vines, keeping the office and the door in view. The sunbeams, playing among the trellised vine shoots, hovered over the 2 poets, making, as it were, an aureole about their heads, bringing the contrast between their faces and their characters into a vigorous relief that would have tempted the brush of some great painter. David's physique was of the kind that nature gives to the fighter, the man born to struggle in obscurity, or with the eyes of all men turned upon him. The strong shoulders, rising above the broad chest, were in keeping with the full development of his whole frame. With his thick crop of black hair, his fleshy, high-colored, swarthy face, supported by a thick neck, he looked at first sight like one of Boileau's canons, but on a second glance there was that in the lines about the thick lips, in the dimple of the chin, in the turn of the square nostrils, with the broad irregular line of central cleavage, and, above all, in the eyes, with the steady light of an all-absorbing love that burned in them, which revealed the real character of the man, the wisdom of the thinker, the strenuous melancholy of a spirit that discerns the horizon on either side, and sees clearly to the end of winding ways, turning the clear light of analysis upon the joys of fruition, known as yet in idea alone, and quick to turn from them in disgust. You might look for the flash of genius from such a face, you could not miss the ashes of the volcano, hopes extinguished beneath a profound sense of the social annihilation to which lowly birth and lack of fortune condemns so many a loftier mind. And by the side of the poor printer, who loathed a handicraft so closely allied to intellectual work, close to this silent, joyless, self-sustained, drinking deep draughts from the cup of knowledge and of poetry that he might forget the cares of his narrow lot in the intoxication of soul and brain, stood Lucian, graceful as some sculptured Indian Bacchus. For in Lucian's face there was the distinction of line which stamps the beauty of the antique, the Greek profile, with the velvet whiteness of women's faces, and eyes full of love, eyes so blue that they looked dark against a pearly setting, and dewy and fresh as those of a child. Those beautiful eyes looked out from under their long chestnut lashes, beneath eyebrows that might have been traced by a Chinese pencil. The silken down on his cheeks, like his bright curling hair, shone golden in the sunlight. A divine graciousness transfused the white temples that caught that golden gleam, a matchless nobleness had set its seal in the short chin raised, but not abruptly. The smile that hovered about the coral lips, yet redder as they seemed by force of contrast with the even teeth, was the smile of some sorrowing angel. Lucian's hands denoted race, they were shapely hands, hands that men obey at a sign, and women love to kiss. Lucian was slender and of middle height. From a glance at his feet, he might have been taken for a girl in disguise, and this so much the more easily from the feminine contour of the hips, a characteristic of keen-witted, not to say, astute, men. This is a trait which seldom misleads, and in Lucian it was a true indication of character, for when he analyzed the society of today, his restless mind was apt to take its stand on the lower ground of those diplomatists who hold that success justifies the use of any means however base. It is one of the misfortunes attendant upon great intellects that perforce they comprehend all things, both good and evil. The two young men judged society by the more lofty standard because their social position was at the lowest end of the scale, for unrecognized power is apt to avenge itself for lowly station by viewing the world from a lofty standpoint. Yet it is, nevertheless, true that they grew but the more bitter and hopeless after these swift soaring flights to the upper regions of thought, their world by right. Lucien had read much and compared, David had thought much and deeply. In spite of the young printer's look of robust, country-bred health, his turn of mind was melancholy and somewhat morbid. He lacked confidence in himself, but Lucien, on the other hand, with a boldness little to be expected from his feminine, almost effeminate, figure, graceful though it was, Lucien possessed the Gascon temperament to the highest degree, rash, brave, and adventurous, prone to make the most of the bright side, and as little as possible of the dark. His was the nature that sticks at no crime if there is anything to be gained by it, and laughs at the vice which serves as a stepping stone. Just now these tendencies of ambition were held in check, partly by the fair illusions of youth, partly by the enthusiasm which led him to prefer the nobler methods, which every man in love with glory tries first of all. Lucien was struggling as yet with himself and his own desires, and not with the difficulties of life, at strife with his own power, and not with the baseness of other men, that fatal exemplar for impressionable minds. The brilliancy of his intellect had a keen attraction for David. David admired his friend, while he kept him out of the scrapes into which he was led by the Furie Française. David, with his well-balanced mind and timid nature at variance with a strong constitution, was by no means wanting in the persistence of the northern temper, and if he saw all the difficulties before him, none the less he vowed to himself to conquer, never to give way. In him the unswerving virtue of an apostle was softened by pity that sprang from inexhaustible indulgence. In the friendship grown old already, one was the worshipper, and that one was David. Lucien ruled him like a woman sure of love, and David loved to give way. He felt that his friend's physical beauty implied a real superiority, which he accepted, looking upon himself as one made of coarser and commoner human clay. The ox for patient labor in the fields, the free life for the bird, he thought to himself. I will be the ox, and Lucien shall be the eagle. So for 3 years these friends had mingled the destinies bright with such glorious promise. Together they read the great works that appeared above the horizon of literature and science since the peace, the poems of Schiller, Goethe, and Byron, the prose writings of Scott, Jean-Paul, Berzelius, Davy, Cuvier, Lamartine, and many more. They warmed themselves beside these great hearthfires, they tried their powers in abortive creations, in work laid aside and taken up again with new glow of enthusiasm. Incessantly they worked with the unwearied vitality of youth, comrades in poverty, comrades in the consuming love of art and science, till they forgot the hard life of the present, for their minds were wholly bent on laying the foundations of future fame. "Lucien," said David, "do you know what I have just received from Paris?" He drew a tiny volume from his pocket. "Listen." And David read, as a poet can read, first André de Chénier's Idyll Near, then Le Malade, following on with the elegy on a suicide, another elegy in the classic taste, and the last two iambs. So that is André de Chénier. Lucien exclaimed again and again. It fills one with despair, he cried for the third time, when David surrendered the book to him, unable to read further for emotion. "A poet rediscovered by a poet," said Lucien, reading the signature of the preface. After Chénier had written those poems, he thought that he had written nothing worth publishing, added David. Then Lucien in his turn read aloud the fragment of an epic called L'Aveugle and 2 or 3 of the elegies, till, when he came upon the line, "If they know not bliss, is there happiness on earth?" He pressed the book to his lips, and tears came to the eyes of either, for the two friends were lovers and fellow worshippers. The vine stems were changing color with the spring, covering the rifted, battered walls of the old house where squalid cracks were spreading in every direction, with fluted columns and knots and bas-reliefs and uncounted masterpieces of I know not what order of architecture, erected by fairy hands. Fancy had scattered flowers and crimson gems over the gloomy little yard, and Chénier's Camille became for David the Eve whom he worshipped, for Lucien a great lady to whom he paid his homage. Poetry had shaken out her starry robe above the workshop where the monkeys and bears were grotesquely busy among types and presses. "5 o'clock struck, but the friends felt neither hunger nor thirst, life had turned to a golden dream, and all the treasures of the world lay at their feet." Far away on the horizon lay the blue streak to which hope points a finger in storm and stress, and a siren voice sounded in their ears, calling, "Come, spread your wings, through that streak of gold or silver or azure lies the sure way of escape from evil fortune." Just at that moment the low glass door of the workshop was opened, and out came Cerizet, an apprentice. David had brought the urchin from Paris. This youth introduced a stranger, who saluted the friends politely, and spoke to David. "This, sir, is a monograph which I am desirous of printing," said he, drawing a huge package of manuscript from his pocket. "Will you oblige me with an estimate?" "We do not undertake work on such a scale, sir," David answered, without looking at the manuscript. "You had better see the Messieurs Cointet about it." "Still we have a very pretty type which might suit it," put in Lucien, taking up the role. "We must ask you to be kind enough, sir, to leave your commission with us and call again tomorrow, and we will give you an estimate." "Have I the pleasure of addressing M. Lucien Chardin?" "Yes, sir," said the foreman. "I am fortunate in this opportunity of meeting with a young poet destined to such greatness," returned the author. "Mme. de Bargeton sent me here." Lucien flushed red at the name, and stammered out something about gratitude for the interest which Mme. de Bargeton took in him. David noticed his friend's embarrassed flush, and left him in conversation with the country gentleman, the author of a monograph on silkwork cultivation, prompted by vanity to print the effort for the benefit of fellow members of the local agricultural society. When the author had gone, David spoke. "Lucien, are you in love with Mme. de Bargeton?" "Passionately." "But social prejudices set you as far apart as if she were living at Pekin and you in Greenland." "The will of two lovers can rise victorious over all things," said Lucien, lowering his eyes. "You will forget us," returned the alarmed lover, as Eve's fair face rose before his mind. "On the contrary, I have perhaps sacrificed my love to you," cried Lucien. "What do you mean?" "In spite of my love, in spite of the different motives which bid me obtain a secure footing in her house, I have told her that I will never go thither again unless another is made welcome to, a man whose gifts are greater than mine, a man destined for a brilliant future, David Setchard, my brother, my friend." "I shall find an answer waiting when I go home." "All the aristocrats may have been asked to hear me read my verses this evening, but I shall not go if the answer is negative, and I will never set foot in Mme. de Bargeton's house again." David brushed the tears from his eyes, and wrung Lucien's hand. The clock struck 6. "Eve must be anxious. Goodbye," Lucien added abruptly. He hurried away. David stood overcome by the emotion that is only felt to the full at his age, and more especially in such a position as his. The friends were like two young swans with wings unclipped as yet by the experiences of provincial life. "Heart of gold," David exclaimed to himself, as his eyes followed Lucien across the workshop. Lucien went down to Lumeau along the broad Promenade de Bully, the Rue du Minage, and St. Peter's Gate. It was the longest way round, so you may be sure that Mme. de Bargeton's house lay on the way. So delicious it was to pass under her windows, though she knew nothing of his presence, that for the past 2 months he had gone round daily by the Pallet Gate into Lumeau. Under the trees of Bully he saw how far the suburb lay from the city. The custom of the country, moreover, had raised other barriers harder to surmount than the mere physical difficulty of the steep flights of steps which Lucien was descending. Youth and ambition had thrown the flying bridge of glory across the gulf between the city and the suburb, yet Lucien was as uneasy in his mind over his lady's answer as any king's favourite who has tried to climb yet higher, and fears that being overbold he is like to fall. This must seem a dark saying to those who have never studied the manners and customs of cities divided into the upper and lower town, wherefore it is necessary to enter here upon some topographical details, and this so much the more if the reader is to comprehend the position of one of the principal characters in the story, Mme. de Bargeton.